Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Yuck. Thank you for watching today. I appreciate you. In this video, I want to talk about some secrets to get smooth shading. I've been getting a lot of questions and comments about people struggling with their shading. So in this video, I want to touch base on the secrets that I use to accomplish a smooth gradient transition. This could be done with a 3-round liner, any needle you want. The same rule of thumb would apply to any needle of your choice. I'm going to be using a piece of Reelskin fake skin to get my points across. This is a Reelskin hand. I'm using my MusoToku Mercury M1 tattoo machine to get my points across. Now for this, I'm using a CNC 3-round liner as well. This is what I'm going to be using to demonstrate my point. I have dynamic black tattooing ink that I'm going to be using, as well as simple petroleum jelly to clean up the fake skin. I will be leaving my Amazon affiliate links and other affiliate links for you in the description below, so you can check out the gear featured in this video in case you want to match it up on your end. One thing that I've noticed where we often focus, especially if we're just starting out with shading, is we often focus on hand speed to voltage and pressure of the needle. Now those are things that we do want to focus on, but since most of us start with lining and then we go to shading, we take those lining fundamentals with us over to shading. That's basically exactly where the misconstrue happens. That's where the bridge becomes ungapped. Now, when we are shading, it is nothing like lining, and we have to remember that. Lining is going to be a whole world of its own. Shading is also going to be an entirely different world of its own. That is one important variable we always have to remember. What that means is the way that you are lining is not going to be the way that you will shade. Let's just get right on into it. So for this, I'm going to be running at 6 volts. I typically shade anywhere between 5 to 6. Oftentimes, I would even line like around 7 to 8 volts depending on the machine that I am using and the grouping size. So when I'm shading, automatically, one main difference is that I'm automatically dropping it to a lower voltage. I'm not going to shade around 7 or 8 volts. You can, I'm not saying it's wrong, but for my specific technical application and technique, I prefer to run at a lower voltage just because it feels more correct for me. We can also use gray wash as well to get smooth, clean gradients and different tones as well. So that's kind of like a given. Anytime we shade, most of the time we're going to be using a gray wash. So for this demonstration though, I'm going to go ahead and just use straight black ink to kind of demonstrate my points here. When we talk about shading, when I first started, what I used to think shading was basically much like lining, where I would simply start from one point and then kind of just shade. The thing is, when I touch down like this and I begin to shade, I'm kind of approaching that introduction like lining. When I line, I do the same thing. I kind of let the needle touch and then I start lining. And then when I started shading, I would do the same thing. Wherever I touch down, I would let the needle kind of drill into the skin. I would make sure that the needle broke the skin, and then I would begin shading. Now the problem with that is wherever I touched down at became really dark really quick. This is going to be one of the main issues that we experience as a beginner tattoo artist, especially when we're trying to lock down shading. Now if you notice right here, where I touch down is, like I mentioned, the darkest point right here. Now depending on the design and what you're trying to do, I'm not saying that this is bad. However, when we shade, one of the major differences between shading and lining is that shading is going to require layers and building up, where lining, it requires us to be in and out. So for example, a line would be like this, whereas opposed to shading would be like this. So right off the bat, these techniques are completely different from one another, and they are not to be misconstrued, misused, or kind of intertwined. You know what I mean? They are their own separate individual techniques entirely. And I feel like, again, when we start, this is where we often start mixing the two, especially when we first introduce that needle upon shading. So when I started, beginners often shade like this, including myself. When I started, we'd go like this, and then we'd whip out, whip out, whip out, and you get the idea. And over we would repeat that. I'm not saying that that's wrong, but the problem is this. You can see how the areas where the needle is introduced are much more darker. Going back to shading, we have to layer up shades to get smooth gradient shading transitions. This right here is a great way to not do that. So the main difference with lining and shading is the entire technique. That's why I keep mentioning that we shouldn't be mixing the two. I know that when we first start out, the only knowledge that we have to go off of is lining. However, once we get more comfortable with lining and we start going into the shading realm, we have to understand that we're essentially going to be building from ground up again in terms of our knowledge, because lining is a world of its own. It requires a completely different set of techniques. Shading is a world of its own. It requires a completely different set of techniques. The same thing with dot work, packing, color. Every individual element, every individual application style that we have within the world of tattooing has to be established from the ground up, forgive me. So every single technique that we're learning, every time we start a new technique that we're learning, we're always going to be building from ground up. So that means we shouldn't be carrying over information from one to another. Does that make sense? There's only little fundamentals that are going to contribute. So for example, when we learn how to line, we're also going to learn how to not go too deep. That little variable will carry over into shading. However, the technical application is going to change completely. I hope that this is making sense, and I hope that you're still with me here. So the secret to shading would be a bunch of moving components working together at once. Some of the main secrets are the machine that you are using. A softer stroke, like a 3.5 millimeter stroke, will give you smoother results. A lower voltage will give you more time to layer up on the skin. Depending on the needle that you're using will determine the results that you're getting. For example, I'm using a 3-round liner for this demonstration. Same rule of thumb will apply to mags. However, you still will get different looks. With the 3-round liner, we're going to get a sort of textured pepper stippled look. If we're using a mag, we're going to get a really clean, smooth, hyper-realistic sort of transition. Depending on what you're going for, it would determine the needle that's right for you. I personally prefer the 3-round liner all the way. It's just my style. It fits more for what I enjoy doing as a tattoo artist. So you're going to notice that right here on this shaded example, it starts from this darker area and then it gradually goes into a lighter area. How we got this smooth gradient transition was by touching down right here, and you can see how I'm using whip out motions like this. So I'm letting the tip of the needle just kind of touch the skin like so. I'm not driving it in like that. I'm just simply literally just scratching, brushing the skin with it. I think brushing is more accurate than scratching, but that's what we're doing. We're just literally brushing the skin. When we line, we do not brush the skin, so that's why I mentioned we shouldn't be carrying over that information from lining to shading. So you're going to see though that brushing the skin right here is going to allow me to get layer upon layer until I reach the entire gradient, the tone that I'm looking for with the correct transitions. So that is one of the main big differences, and that's like one of the main secrets there with shading, is that when we are shading, we are always going to be brushing the ink into the skin, and we're not going to be depositing like we would with lining. So you can see that right here I'm starting with a darker point and then whipping out. But when it comes to shading, there's also an area where, or there's going to be areas where there's not going to be a darker or lighter point, and we just need to simply layer up the tones. When we don't have a darker area to start with and we have an area to kind of start layering shades over that doesn't have any sort of definitive starting and ending points, I typically use pendulum motions, which are back and forth motions. There is no harsh introduction or exit. So when I'm using pendulum motions, it would look like this right here. And you can see that there really is no definitive starting and ending point. There's just pendulum motions. And then once we start layering up these motions in different directions, we're going to go ahead and get darker and lighter tones. Now stay with me here. I'm going to go ahead and kind of go over these little points here about shading, and then all together they make a technique. So what I'm referring to here is pendulum. You can see that we are getting pepper shades right here, but we don't have a definitive starting point or an ending point. Now, when it comes to shading, we're definitely going to be using both of these techniques to complete a design. It doesn't matter if the design is more simplistic. Typically, we would want to know how to do both of these, so that way we can kind of apply the shading as we see fit without hitting any sort of walls. Now, a secret to shading is just that. We're going to want to layer up the shades using a gray wash or an ink that we are comfortable with until we get our desired tones. Not everything requires dark to light, not everything requires light to dark. We can add, different tones in different areas using pendulum motions and whip motions, which are these. A whip motion typically has a definitive starting point that's darker, whipping out to a lighter point with a gradual transition. You can see pendulum motions don't have that. They do have textured and different tones, but there is no definitive starting and ending point. So the secret to shading is just that. We are not going to be hard lining anything into the skin. We are going to essentially be building up layers of different tones using the very tip of the needle. To get comfortable using the very tip of the needle, you can use an exercise like this, where you simply go ahead and just kind of either graze the skin and stay like that on the tip of the needle and just practice that sort of depth there by grazing the skin like that. Or you can do pendulum motions where you're introducing the line into the skin and then you're introducing it back out. I talk about this and I give you visual demonstrations and literature in my Fundamental Tattoo Handbook. It talks all about pendulum motions and hand speed as well. But you're going to see that when we use pendulum motions, we're getting these little dots, and these are those brush-like motions that I'm referring to. And this is essentially the secret of shading. We are going to be layering up this technique to accomplish the tones. We aren't going to be doing it like this. So you can see I'm kind of just using vigorous force here. And when I do that, you're going to see how quickly I went to a dark point here, and that was only with one pass. So you can see that this area now is completely dark. There's not really a peppered look, it's a bit inconsistent, as opposed to the surrounding areas right here that have a sort of textured look, even spaced dots, and a clean read. So when we are shading, we don't want to approach it like lining. We want to be delicate, we want to be gentle, we really want to take our time with the technical process. So you can see that I'm using just the very tip here, going back and forth. And there really is no special way to hold your machine. You can still, for example, I can line like this. If I like to line, I can line it like this. I don't have to adjust. I can do a pendulum motion as well, holding the machine the same. So it's not really a matter of changing any sort of heavy flow or the way that I'm holding the machine. It's more about the way that I am applying the technique and introducing the needle to the skin. That introduction is one of the main secrets. So you're going to see this introduction is going to be like this. And that's typically an introduction for lining, where we taper in, let the needle catch into the skin and taper out. And then with shading, the introduction would be like this. There's no definitive starting and ending point, as you can see right here. We are just simply using back and forth pendulum motions to layer up the shade. And you can see the starting point, ending point, we cannot tell where it starts, as we could this one right here where we were using whip motions. So whip motions typically have a trail where we start, where we finish. Pendulum motions don't. We combine these two techniques to finish one entire design. Now, the secret to shading would be that we are simply going to be layering up the shades until we reach a specific tone that we are looking for and transition that we want. That's essentially the secret. The secret is not to approach it like lining, where we're simply, drilling the needle into there. We only need the very tips of the needle to do any of the work for us. And I assure you, the tip of the needle is more than enough to get your shades going. Same rule of thumb is going to apply to a mag, to a round shader. It doesn't really matter what needle you use. The same concept, same rule of thumb will be transferred to all needles. Now, I know this video is kind of sparse and sporadic and a little bit over the place here. I'm trying to kind of demonstrate while I'm giving you real world examples and explaining real time. So, long story short, the secret to smooth shading is to get comfortable with the gear that you're using, pick the right needle that's right for your style and application and the tattoo design at hand, pick a voltage that you are comfortable with, and focus on the brush-like motions using pendulum and whip motions where necessary. You're also going to want to focus on the direction, like some shading may require a curve like this. So you want to pay attention to just all the little details, while other shades may require straight shading like this in certain areas. So the idea would be to pay attention to what you are doing, really pay attention to the design, and declare if you're going to be using whip shades or pendulum motions before you even begin to apply it. You're going to want to layer up your shadings, and you're not going to want to approach it the same way you would like lining, where you just hard line everything like that. Remember, shading is a much more delicate process that really does require brush-like motions, and lots of patience. Sometimes, depending on how soft our hand is and depending on the ink that we're using, like if we're using a really light tone, sometimes with shading we could even go over specific parts like maybe 6, 8, 9 times. It really depends on the artist. That determines, you know, how many passes we have before we start overworking the skin. Just because we layer and layer and layer with proper technique does not mean that we're going to overwork the skin. The way we overwork the skin is with improper technique and too many passes. Proper technique and a heavy amount of passes has never really overworked the skin because the technique was correct. We're not damaging the skin once we have those sort of brush-like pendulum motions. So that's another common mismatch that I've seen a lot within tattooing, where people think just because when we line we have 1 or 2 tries to get in and out, they automatically assume that that's the same for shading, when it's not. Shading, we can definitely add way more layers than we ever could if we line, because the techniques are to be applied completely different. Secrets recap real quick. We want to use machine that we're comfortable with, needle that we're comfortable with, ink that we're comfortable with. We also want to use motions that we are comfortable with and develop, such as whip motions and pendulum motions. And then from there we want to make sure that our ink has varying tones and that we're placing those tones in the correct spot. There really is no way around the shading but through it. This right here I feel is like a great place to start. We have to be aware that shading, the technical application, is going to be completely different from lining. We have to be aware that we will in fact be layering up to get the tones that we want. These are little things that we have to remember as a tattoo artist, and these little things will kind of guide us in a better direction. However, if you have any questions, you want to get clarifications on anything at all, please, I encourage you to drop a comment below. I'll do my absolute best to assist you in the best possible direction. But for now, that'll be it. I do feel like I touched some key points here in this video. I appreciate you. Thank you very much for watching. If you found this video helpful, give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel, as I will be bringing more tattoo videos like this for you. With that being said, thank you very much. I appreciate you, your time, and your support. I hope you have a great day.